This is an American housewife. She finds that each new trip to the local supermarket is enough to bring her to tears. Her dollars just won't buy what they once did, and her family's needs are increasing all the time. As prices continue to soar, she wonders where the terrifying trend will end. This couple retired 10 years ago with a perfectly adequate income. Now, in order to make ends meet, they have to cut back or even do without many things that they considered routine only a few years ago. They are even beginning to wonder if they'll be able to afford the home that they've lived in for 40 years. This young couple has been saving to purchase a home. They have begun to realize that the purchasing power of their savings is shrinking right before their eyes. The interest earned by their savings doesn't even match the lost value, and they are, in fact, going backwards. With the price of everything going up steadily, their ability to add to their savings has been cut, and they wonder about the future, too. This businessman is feeling the effects of steadily rising costs for materials, for labor, and especially for taxation. His profits are shrinking, and the squeeze affecting him has also affected his customers, so that the volume of his sales is also dropping. The future doesn't look very bright to him either. Problems such as these are occurring all over the United States. The cause is something called inflation. What inflation really is and how its disastrous effects can be stopped is the subject of Dollars and Cents. Inflation is already a serious problem in the United States. But if the truth about inflation were known, the American people would demand a thorough house cleaning in Washington, D.C. Most Americans, if they had the truth about inflation, would also find their suspicions about the questionable dependability of the mass media confirmed. So what is it about inflation that should be known? The first thing that should be known is its definition. Most Americans believe that inflation is the condition of rising prices, but that definition is wrong. And finding a correct solution to a problem that is wrongly defined is impossible. If we consult a reliable dictionary, instead of relying on popularly held beliefs, we will find a very different story. Here, for instance, is the definition of inflation found in Webster's New 20th Century Unabridged Dictionary, 1957. Inflation, an increase in the amount of currency in circulation, resulting in a relatively sharp and sudden fall in its value and a rise in prices. Let us note that inflation is also an increase in the amount of credit, a type of currency. In this presentation, we shall confine our discussion to the constant increase of paper dollars. This definition does not say that inflation is rising prices. It says that inflation causes rising prices. Americans have been told and therefore believe that the effects of inflation, especially the rising prices, are in fact inflation itself. Consequently, all of us have been encouraged to treat the effect rather than the cause, a procedure which will not only not bring about the sought-after solution, but will frequently make any problem even worse. Treating the effect rather than the cause is done if a person pours ice water over a feverish child. What is needed instead is some remedy for the cause of the fever. Ice water in this instance can make the child's condition worse. What probably should be done is administer some antibiotics to attack the cause of the fever. So too, if we really wish to correct the problem of inflation, an attack upon the cause of rising prices and not upon the rising prices themselves is the only effective way to proceed. How does inflation, an increase in the amount of currency in circulation, result in the condition of rising prices? Simply because the creation of more dollars means that the value of all dollars has been reduced. The very presence of the additional currency makes all existing dollars less valuable. One reason why this is so is because of the increased ease with which dollars become available. But another reason is that whatever value the dollars are supposed to represent does not change, yet there are more dollars representing that value. Hence, each dollar is worth less. With cheaper dollars in circulation, a merchant must ask for more of them in return for his goods and services, a condition we note as a rise in prices. To illustrate the fact that inflation causes currency to lose value and prices to rise, consider that you are at an art auction. You have $1,000 to bid for paintings. Just as you are preparing to bid, a stranger walks into the room and gives $1,000 to half the persons at the auction, but not to you. The stranger has inflated the quantity of dollars at the auction. Now let's see what happens. When paintings are offered, those with the newly acquired dollars are able to bid past your limit. The price for paintings has gone up, and your dollars just aren't as valuable as when you arrived at the auction. Both effects, the rising prices and the diminished value of the dollars, were caused by an increase in the quantity of money at the auction. Yet we live in a world of business which is actually a gigantic auction. More currency in circulation will cause the exact same effects in the marketplace as it did at the art auction. While we have been referring to two results of inflation, increased prices and less valuable currency, it is more accurate to say that they are really two aspects of the same single effect of inflation. Inflation causes a decrease in the value of currency, but we most often refer to this condition as an increase in prices. Actually, prices are not affected by inflation. It is the value of the currency that is affected. For instance, a $20 gold piece was obtainable 50 years ago for $20 in paper currency. Today, that same $20 gold piece commands over 250 paper dollars. The price of the gold isn't what changed. It is the value of the currency that has been altered. So, the obvious solution to the problem of inflation is to stop increasing the amount of currency. The only agency in the United States that can increase the amount of currency, which is therefore the only agency that can correctly be blamed for the problems associated with inflation, is our federal government. That's right, the federal government is responsible for inflation and for its crushing effects, the diminishing value of the dollar and the resulting rise in the price of everything. Housewives don't cause inflation, even though federal officials tell us that they don't know how to shop wisely. Businessmen who are simply trying to stay alive when they raise their prices don't cause inflation. Farmers aren't guilty, nor are labor unions, distributors, or anyone other than government. When federal officials and the news media in our country tell the American people that anyone but government causes inflation, they are perpetuating a monstrously dangerous fraud. And when merchants tell Americans that their lower prices are fighting inflation, they are either displaying their ignorance or counting on yours. One reason why the federal government increases the quantity of currency is quite easy to understand. It does so to cover its deficits, and these deficits are the result of government spending more than it has, almost always to pay for programs which the people would never allow if they were taxed directly to pay for them. Inflation, in fact, is a hidden form of taxation, which is going on steadily in our country. Ultimately, the government simply prints more currency to pay its bills. The additional currency takes value from all of the currency possessed by the people, just as if all of us were taxed. What about this paper currency that the government now prints in such great quantities? We all know that paper money is really pieces of paper, which are supposed to represent something of value. Where government assumed the power to increase the supply of currency is an important consideration. So, in order to better understand what has been happening to our currency and to ourselves, let's look back into history and try to determine what money really is. To begin with, money should be defined as a medium for indirect exchange. When individuals exchange goods for goods or goods for services, they engage in direct exchange, the barter system. There is no medium of exchange used, no money. But as soon as someone trades his goods or services for something he does not intend to keep, in order to trade this new acquisition for something he wants very much, his first acquisition is being used by him as a medium for indirect exchange. For example, Mr. A trades his wheat to Mr. B for a cow. Mr. A then trades the cow to Mr. C for a wagon, which is what he really wanted for his wheat in the first place. The cow was a medium of exchange for Mr. A. It served exactly the same purpose for him that paper dollars do for us. What made the cow useful as money was the fact that it possessed value of itself to all parties concerned. In other words, the cow had intrinsic worth. That characteristic, intrinsic worth to all parties concerned, is absolutely essential for honest money. So let us begin to list the essential characteristics that any commodity must have if it is to serve as money. The first is intrinsic worth. In the example already cited, we saw that the cow had intrinsic worth, and that it was used as money. And while it may seem odd to us today, cattle actually were used as money in the past. Problems soon became obvious, however. One problem was the size of a cow, which prevented its use for small transactions without destroying the usefulness as money of the whole cow. Another was that of the size of the cow hindered its ability to be transported. And a third was the need to feed the cow. It soon became obvious that whatever was used as money must be divisible in order to be practical. So we add divisibility as another essential characteristic of money. And because the cow was not divisible, the use of cattle as money was discarded. At another time in history, tobacco was used as money. It possessed intrinsic worth and it was divisible. But whenever the tobacco rotted or spoiled, men discovered another necessary characteristic of money. It is that the commodity used as money must be durable. So we add durability to our list and note that tobacco is no longer used as money. Then we find such items as seashells being used as money. Their beauty gave them value. Their size enabled them to be used in conducting small transactions, and they were relatively durable. But when a large supply of seashells was found on a newly discovered beach, the introduction of all these into the system destroyed the value of all the seashells. What had happened was inflation, an increase in the quantity of currency. The rapid increase in the number of seashells first caused a lowering of the value of all the seashells, and then the seashells became worthless. In the process, some men acquired the goods of others, and then the whole economic system collapsed. These same disastrous effects of inflation can be expected whether the money is seashells, dollars, or anything. Therefore, another very important characteristic of money becomes obvious. Whatever is to be used as money must be relatively scarce, so that its value cannot be diluted through overabundance. Summarizing then, the commodity used as money should have the following characteristics. 1. Intrinsic worth. 2. Divisibility. 3. Durability. 4. Relative scarcity. These characteristics have not been decided upon by any economist, any professor, or any government. Instead, they have been determined by the accumulated experience of mankind throughout history. Using the benefit of that experience, then, what commodities have men turned to for use as money? Paper? Of course not. Paper has little intrinsic worth, it is not durable, and is certainly not scarce. The answer, of course, is precious metal, gold in particular, and in some instances, silver. Gold has intrinsic worth, a fact that is obvious because everyone is pleased to have it. Its divisibility is obvious, for it can be shaped into coins or bars and is useful as dust. Because gold is one of the few chemically inert metals, it will not even rust, much less spoil in almost any surrounding. It is very durable. And in those few places where gold is found in the earth, it is difficult to extract, meaning, of course, that gold is relatively scarce. Therefore, when gold is used as money, inflation, an increase in the quantity of money causing a destruction in its value, is next to impossible. Gold, therefore, has repeatedly been recognized as a very good commodity to choose for money. Silver is also useful as money because it, too, possesses these same characteristics, although in slightly lesser degrees than gold. When the use of gold as money increased, the problem of safeguarding and accumulation of it developed. Rather than store the gold in his home, thereby inviting thieves, a holder of gold would deposit it in a warehouse or vault established by some enterprising individual in the community. For each unit of gold that was deposited, the owner of the gold was given a warehouse receipt. With these warehouse receipts, then, began the use of paper certificates, which were not really money at all, but money substitutes. When an owner of gold transacted some business, he would transfer his claim on the gold by simply handing over the warehouse receipt. As long as it was known that gold was available to the holder of the warehouse receipt, this initial form of paper currency was honored everywhere in the community. But when the owner of the warehouse noted that very little of the gold in his vaults was moving in and out of the warehouse, he began a very clever but immoral practice. He printed some extra warehouse receipts and used them himself to acquire goods. There was no gold in the warehouse for these extra receipts, and if everyone who now had a receipt came to demand gold, the warehouse owner would have been exposed as a thief. What he had done was inflate the currency. He increased the quantity of money substitutes which the community had begun to consider money. He had actually stolen from everyone in the process because the value of all of the receipts had been reduced proportionately. He used that little bit of value from each warehouse receipt to acquire goods for himself. A run on his warehouse by all those who possessed receipts for gold would probably have resulted in his being hanged. But no one knew what he had done. He had cleverly and quietly confiscated a portion of the wealth of the community without the people being aware. The fact that this thievery wasn't immediately known does not mean that he was any less a thief. It is this type of thievery that governments practice all the time, and it is exactly what our government is doing to us. Paper currency, actually a money substitute, is only honest when the real money for which it is a substitute is readily available to its holder. Now let's take a look at the currency in use in our country during the 20th century. What you now see is a display of the different types of currency that Americans have used over the past 60 years. Just examining the bills themselves tells quite a story about what is happening to our money and what is happening to us. The first bill is a gold certificate which was issued in 1928. It says, "This certifies that there have been deposited in the Treasury of the United States of America $50 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand." That pledge was met by the United States government whenever anyone asked for the gold in return for this gold certificate. This particular currency was so respected that it gave rise to the expression, "good as gold," which it surely was. It was probably the finest paper money that the world has ever known. But in 1933, our government took us off the gold standard and even passed a law making it illegal for Americans to own gold. So gold certificates and that good, honest promise to provide gold disappeared. Next, we see a silver certificate dated 1957. It says, "This certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand." Had a holder of one of these asked for silver until 1968, the government would have honored the pledge. But in 1968, President Johnson and the Congress repudiated its obligation to back currency with silver or anything. This type of paper money then disappeared, and so, too, did much of the gold and the silver that formerly backed it. The next piece of currency in our display is the first of the Federal Reserve notes. We have previously shown two types of U.S. Treasury notes. What you now see is not a U.S. Treasury note, but a Federal Reserve note, issued by the government-created Federal Reserve System, our nation's central bank. A central bank for controlling money and credit was deemed an absolute necessity by Karl Marx when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. The United States was saddled with the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Since then, it is the Federal Reserve that has had the power to inflate our currency and to make decisions regarding money which affect the lives and property of every American citizen. The first of the Federal Reserve notes said, "redeemable in gold on demand," and any holder of this type of note could get gold for it until 1933. This particular note was issued in 1928. But when the Roosevelt administration took us off the gold standard, this type of currency became a collector's item. The Federal Reserve System then gave us another type of note, which said, "This note is redeemable in lawful money." In October 1969, an American citizen walked into the Federal Reserve Bank in Los Angeles, presented a $50 Federal Reserve note carrying this same statement, and asked for some lawful money. He contended that the paper note that he had presented could not be lawful money if it was itself redeemable in lawful money. But he was told that he could exchange his $50 bill for any other $50 Federal Reserve note, or for any combination of other Federal Reserve notes adding up to $50. He wanted lawful money, and was told that he could not have anything other than more paper money. As he left the Federal Reserve Bank, he recalled that the U.S. Constitution forbade any state to, quote, "make anything but gold or silver coin a tender in payment of debts," end quote, and also that powers not expressly given to the federal government could not be assumed. What this man found out, and obviously knew beforehand, was that there was no backing of any kind behind the paper money. Which brings us to the last piece of currency in our display, which says, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." This is the type of currency which Americans carry in their pockets and purses today. In other words, the currency is redeemable in nothing. And not only is all this currency redeemable in nothing, but all other U.S. currency is equally redeemable in nothing, no matter what it says on it. The currency in use today depends for its value on the fact that the American people don't know that it has nothing backing it up, and also the fact that the government commands everyone to accept it in payment for debts. As long as Americans will accept this currency in payment for goods and services, it is still usable. But any coin dealer will quickly confirm to you that its value is falling steadily, because a $20 gold piece costs over $250. And no matter how many edicts the government publishes telling us that valueless money is valuable, the fraud is becoming known. It is already known abroad where individuals who are not required by the U.S. government to accept American dollars are repudiating them or charging a premium for accepting them. In the United States, we have proceeded from the finest, most honorable currency the world has ever known to totally irredeemable paper. As the amount of paper in circulation grows because of government inflation, the public will become aware of its worthlessness or will be forced by circumstances to repudiate it. Recently, the owner of a movie theater in eastern Massachusetts showed his awareness of the declining value of paper currency and sandwich coins when he announced that he would admit anyone to his theater for a paper dollar, 4 sandwich quarters, or 1 pre-1965 silver quarter. When gold or silver was behind the currency, the amount of paper that the government was able to print was limited by the amount of gold or silver in the treasury. Even when laws were passed allowing the government to double or quadruple the amount of paper compared to what it held in gold or silver, thus legalizing the crime of the warehouse owner, the amount of currency was still limited. But now that all backing for the currency has been removed, the only limitation on the amount of currency in circulation is the size of the national debt. And this is no limitation at all because Congress increases the debt ceiling all the time. If a private citizen printed more dollars to cover his excessive spending, he'd be branded a counterfeiter, and he'd be hounded by Treasury agents until he was caught. Counterfeiting, as we all know, is the printing of unbacked paper currency for the purpose of stealing. But there's a good lesson to be learned from studying why it is that counterfeiting is wrong. After all, if an individual can produce nice-looking $20 bills which have the same quality paper and ink, why shouldn't he be allowed to continue? Most Americans would say that counterfeiting is wrong because it enables the counterfeiter to acquire someone else's goods and services without giving anything of value in exchange. That's true. And for that reason alone, counterfeiting is wrong. But others would go a bit farther and say that a counterfeiter might seek to raid the U.S. Treasury of its gold or silver, which would also be wrong. However, this was wrong only when there was gold or silver behind the currency. Today, there is nothing backing our paper dollars. Counterfeiting is wrong because it amounts to inflation, which is stealing. If at a time that our currency were backed by gold or silver, a private citizen wished to print his own currency and also wished to deposit an equivalent amount of gold in the treasury, then he would not be defrauding anyone. But this never happened. The printing of unbacked paper currency for the purpose of stealing, counterfeiting, is always wrong, whether it's done by individuals or governments. It is not at all incorrect to say that the government is in the counterfeiting business. What has been done to our money has been done quietly, and where questioned, the government has insisted that the process has amounted to progress. But irredeemable currency and inflation is not progress at all. It is treachery that can only lead to national and personal disaster. We might ask ourselves, what happens to the nation, to its economy and its stability when currency is made worthless? The answer is that productivity stops, commerce grinds to a halt, savings, insurance policies, and retirement funds evaporate, businesses close, jobs evaporate, and chaos becomes the order of the day. Productivity stops because one of the most important byproducts of the use of money is the resulting widespread division of labor. Men are enabled through the use of money to undertake every conceivable type of employment. The use of money allows for a wide variation in productivity. It allows for ease in transportation, marketing, and distribution of goods. And it allows men to use their labors and to be compensated for them in countless numbers of ways. The use of money is, in fact, a cause of advancing civilization, not a result of it. The tremendous material progress which has so characterized our nation is traceable in great measure to the fact that we have used money, and our money has been honest. Commerce ceases when money becomes worthless, because there is no available medium for exchange. How is a man who produces refrigerators in Indiana, or automobiles in Michigan, or electronic equipment in Arizona, going to be paid by a man who wants such items in New Jersey or California? Without money, commerce simply stops. Savings, retirement funds, insurance policies, and any other investment whose value is based on sound currency will also evaporate. Businesses will close when their owners are unable to sell their goods. Jobs will then evaporate. The situation will become one of desperation and chaos, as everyone is immediately forced to trade whatever he might have of value for food, fuel, and clothing. And even these basic necessities will become unavailable because the men who processed, transported, stored, and merchandised these items in return for money are themselves forced out of business. The horror we are describing is not the product of an overactive imagination. All of this actually occurred in Germany in the early 1920s. Prior to World War I, in 1914, a single German mark was worth about 24 cents in equivalent American currency. After the war was over, the mark had fallen in value to about 11 cents. But then inflation really took hold in Germany, and the value of the mark fell proportionately. 1914, one egg cost 8/100ths of a mark. By 1918, one egg cost 25/100ths of a mark. By 1922, the single egg cost 180 marks. In the summer of 1923, the same type of egg cost 5,000 marks. And in November of 1923, just prior to the total collapse, a single egg cost 80 billion marks. 1 pound of meat cost 90/100ths of a mark in 1914, and 2 marks in 1918. By 1922, a pound of meat cost 1,200 marks. In the summer of 1923, the same type of meat cost 90,000 marks per pound. And in November of 1923, a single pound of meat cost 3,200 billion marks. When the end came in Germany, everyone who was left holding currency found it to be worthless. Jobs were lost, businesses were closed, savings and retirement funds evaporated, and chaos was everywhere. Just prior to the final collapse, the German worker asked to be paid in the morning so that he could meet his wife at noon and she could then spend the money before it lost any more value. German citizens actually used large baskets to carry the paper money. The currency you see before you is a note for 100,000 German marks. It carries an issue date of February 1st, 1923. It would have been a small fortune in 1918, but only a few months after it was issued, it would only buy 1 pound of meat. By the end of the year, only 9 months after it was issued, it was absolutely worthless. Here are some German bonds purchased by a patriotic German citizen in 1922. Whoever owned these was to be repaid in installments beginning in 1926, with final payment in 1932. But before any of the installments were paid, these coupons were not worth the paper they were printed on. What happened in Germany in 1923 was caused by government. And what is happening in the United States today is also being caused by government. Undoubtedly, there are many Americans who want very much to believe that the horror of not being able to work, not being able to obtain food and fuel, and not being able to rely on accumulated savings, investments, and insurance will not happen to us. But we have no good reason to think that all of this won't happen. In fact, it is possible that all of this horror could happen to Americans in the very near future. But what is even more possible, and is, we believe, the ultimate goal of those who are destroying our currency, is the imposition of total government power over the lives of the American people. The man whose picture you now see is John Maynard Keynes. An Englishman, Keynes lived from 1883 until 1946. He was a member of a group called the Fabian Socialist Society, whose purpose was to bring about socialistic control of one nation after another until total world control was theirs. Shortly after World War I, Keynes wrote a book entitled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, wherein, among other things, he told his readers of his admiration for and friendship with Lenin, the communist dictator. Keynes and Lenin both knew a great deal about money, inflation, and economics, and they shared a great hatred of economic freedom, preferring instead the socialist communist system. In The Economic Consequences of the Peace, John Maynard Keynes wrote, Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. Which is exactly what we have tried to demonstrate in this presentation. If the enemies of the United States wanted to destroy our wonderful country and to overturn our system, which has meant freedom and abundance for our people, they could certainly accomplish their goals by destroying our currency. And as business slows down, as savings melt away, as fear of the future becomes commonplace, and as our whole economic system is threatened, it is obvious that an enemy from within is succeeding. Keynes had many admirers in the United States who were themselves members of Fabian socialist organizations in America, such as the League for Industrial Democracy, the Americans for Democratic Action, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Among the warmest admirers of Keynes while he lived were such prominent Americans as newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Generally speaking, what Keynes and his followers wanted to do was bring about state socialism by destroying a nation's currency while constantly building the power of government. Deficit spending, huge federal budgets, and inflation have always been pet projects of the Fabians. For years, the United States has been run by men who were Keynesians, even if they did not realize it themselves. No matter whether Democrats or Republicans were elected, the plans of those who wished to destroy our country continued. In 1968, the American people elected Richard Nixon, whom many thought would provide a change from the steady move toward socialistic big government. Instead, his administration was responsible for more deficit spending, more inflation, and more new government controls than any other administration in history. Most observers of the economic suicide practiced by Richard Nixon were not surprised when he admitted in January 1971 that he was now a Keynesian in economics. Much more than his admission, however, his policies indicated that this was so. Under Richard Nixon, our currency was being destroyed. Our government was gaining control over us, and state socialism was staring us in the face. But after Richard Nixon was forced out of office, Gerald Ford's administration has only made matters worse. The names of some of the key players have changed, but the sinister game is still unfolding. Yes, inflation is a means whereby the government first confiscates the wealth of the people and then destroys their freedom. And while the officials of our government are consistently inflating the quantity of money, they deliberately deceive the people about inflation. Here, for example, we find Herbert Stein in July of 1974, while he was chairman of President Nixon's Council of Economic Ministers, telling the American people that they are the cause of inflation and that their self-discipline in spending is necessary to stop it. In September 1974, newspapers across the country carried news about a meeting of top economists from business, labor, education, and government. All kinds of proposals were offered to curb inflation, but almost all were based on a wrong definition of what inflation really is. The results of this meeting could be summed up in the oft-repeated but wrong attitude that inflation is a difficult, elusive problem and not even the experts can solve it. That, of course, is pure hokum. Inflation is easy to understand and easy to stop. Many of the experts, such as Arthur Burns of the Federal Reserve System, suggest wage and price controls as a cure for inflation. This is a classic example of treating the effect, not the cause. When money loses value, it appears as though prices rise. But wage and price controls, which treat the price rise, force a producer to sell his goods at a loss, thereby forcing him out of business. This makes fewer goods available and contributes to the destruction of the nation. Wage and price controls will no more help to stop the problem of inflation today than they did when the Emperor Diocletian instituted them in the death throes of the Roman Empire. When looking around for dangerous and silly suggestions for combating inflation, however, we sadly find that President Ford outdid everyone. On October 15, 1974, he announced his Whip Inflation Now Win program. If you wrote to the White House, you would receive a little win button to wear in your lapel. The WIN campaign included a dozen ways to treat the problem of rising prices, but virtually nothing to curb the government's program of inflation. President Ford did a great deal to perpetuate the fraudulent notion that inflation is rising prices and that somehow the people and not the government were at fault. He told us to plant WIN gardens, recycle scrap, become more productive, waste less, and even clean up our dinner plates. What does any of that have to do with stopping the government from increasing the quantity of money? Nothing. Notice that all of these suggestions by officials, experts, and even the president are aimed at convincing the people that it is they who are the culprits. None are aimed at the government, which is the only source of the problem. After telling us to clean our dinner plates and plant a garden, President Ford proposed a federal budget with the largest single planned deficit in the history of our nation. He says that his budget will include a planned deficit of $52 billion, and it might even reach $70 billion. When the federal government prints more currency to cover that kind of deficit, the value of the dollar should hit a new low, and the prices of everything should hit new highs. As might be expected, the deceivers who have inflated our currency, thereby robbing us and leading us into economic chaos, also have a solution to the problem they have created. The solution is world currency under United Nations control. Here is an article written by a former congressman who is now a university professor. In calling for United Nations currency, he is even suggesting that our nation go beyond the plans offered by John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, an assistant secretary of the Treasury during the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Harry Dexter White was positively identified as a communist in sworn testimony before government agencies. Yet this same Harry Dexter White was the moving force behind the creation of the United Nations International Monetary Fund. And the IMF is already in the business of issuing an international currency called Special Drawing Rights, SDRs. SDRs are called paper gold, but they aren't paper gold at all. They are paper. There is, in fact, no such thing as paper gold. What is being proposed is exclusive use of this type of currency. but it will mean United Nations control of the world's currency. It will give the United Nations the power to do to the whole world what has already been done to individual nations by their own governments. And it will also mean a loss of sovereignty for those nations which allow their money to be controlled by the World Organization. If our leaders were really serious about getting us out of the grip of inflation, they would not create gigantic deficits which they cover by printing vast quantities of new currency. If our leaders were really desirous of stopping the toboggan slide we are presently on, they would see to it that there was something of value behind our currency. If our leaders were honestly trying to solve the problem of inflation, they would not deceitfully blame the people for it. There are some simple steps that can be taken by our government to save the dollar, and to save our nation and our freedom. But before we list them, we offer a word of caution to anyone who might be thinking solely about protecting himself from the fate that fell on the German people in 1923 and is staring us in the face today. It would not be illogical at all to decide to acquire gold and silver coins whose value would still exist should the paper currency become worthless. Nor would it be illogical to store food and other essential items. It's always a good idea to be prepared for a temporary emergency. But the situation facing us is different than the one which faced the German people. That difference is the threat of a loss of sovereignty, which the destroyers really mean to accomplish. Germany was wrecked by inflation, but the German people still had their country. If the United States continues on its present disastrous course, you can be certain that our leaders will propose steps which will transfer our independence to the obviously anti-American United Nations. So it becomes essential for Americans to restore and then preserve the system here in the United States. If the plans of those who are destroying our money and our economic freedom are completed, a loss of sovereignty and then tyranny will be our fate. At that time, anyone caught spending gold or silver coins will be arrested, and those who have food in their basements will be declared enemies of the state. What we are saying is that there is no way that any individual can protect himself if the American system is destroyed. So it becomes obvious that a first priority should be the preservation of the system. Nothing else makes much sense at all. In order to save our nation, our dollar, and our freedom, the following steps must be taken. 1. No more inflation. Government must be forced to stop increasing the quantity of currency in circulation. 2. No more deficit spending. An end to such madness would largely remove the existing mechanism for inflating the currency. 3. All wasteful, unnecessary, and unconstitutional federal programs should be abolished. 4. The federal government should establish a goal of again issuing redeemable currency backed by gold or silver. 5. The government and the communications media must be forced to tell the truth about inflation, about money, and about everything. 6. The United States should get out of the United Nations, and then the United Nations should be told to leave the United States. When this is accomplished, any possibility that our sovereignty could be transferred to the world government during a manufactured crisis will be removed. We can then work to restore our own currency and solve our own problems. To accomplish these goals, Americans must work together first to inform our fellow citizens and then to put pressure on our leaders to implement these important steps. Organizations like the John Birch Society's TRIM committees for tax reform immediately are exactly what are needed to create the awareness that will lead to correctly solving our problems. Americans, your own government and your press, television and radio are deceiving you about inflation. In addition, your government is steering our nation toward economic helplessness while setting the stage for a transfer of our independence. What could happen does not have to happen to us and to our country. If enough Americans are warned in time, the ravages of inflation and its consequences can be stopped by an aroused and determined public. And this is where each person counts. Tell the person who is showing this film to you that you want to help in the program to awaken the people of this great nation. Then roll up your sleeves and get busy in this great crusade. Help to show this film to others. Distribute literature which tells the unvarnished truth about inflation. Contact your congressmen and your senators and get others to do the same. In general, get informed and get involved. We can restore our currency, we can preserve our freedom and maintain our nation's independence. And then, with a sound dollar acting as the stimulus it once was, America will begin a new era of prosperity and abundance unparalleled in history. The opportunity is right before you. and the need could hardly be greater. We know that you won't fail to respond.